This week's edition of NJBIA is Minding Your Business is brought to you in part by AT&T, helping family, friends, and neighbors connect in meaningful ways every day. By PSE&G, powering a future where people use less energy that's cleaner, safer, and delivered more reliably than ever. By New Jersey's community colleges, aligning education to build an innovative workforce. Find out how your business can benefit at njpathways.org. And by New Jersey Business Magazine, providing critical information needs for New Jersey's business community for more than 67 years.
Welcome to NJBIA's Minding Your Business. I'm Bob Considine. Well, you probably did not realize this, but this year, AT&T is celebrating the 150th anniversary of the first telephone call made by Alexander Graham Bell. So we decided to visit the AT&T Museum in Middletown and spoke with Archives Manager Melissa Knoll to see how that first call happened and how AT&T then dialed in with a century and a half of telecommunications innovation. Have a look. Melissa, thank you for having us here at AT&T Labs, where we celebrate the 150th anniversary of the first phone call by Alexander Graham Bell. I wanted to ask you, what kind of got us to that point before the phone call? What was Mr. Bell working on?
So Alexander Graham Bell was a very interesting individual. One would almost say he was uniquely suited for the historical moment that he found himself in. Mm-hmm. So his father and his uncle were elocutionists.
Right.
And so Alexander Graham Bell, having that as his background, also happened to have a deaf mother after age 11. So he was very interested in how did hearing work. He even conducted experiments by age 11, trying to figure out different things about the world and everything else. So he was very uniquely suited and had this very high drive and ambition to invent something and make himself known. Now, what's very interesting is that he manages to combine that science and understanding of hearing with Thomas Watson's understanding of electricity. So the two of them together are able to make the invention possible. Alexander Graham Bell did not have the electrical backing or the actual understanding of electricity that he needed to make the components. He relied on Thomas Watson to do that. Okay. And interestingly enough, we have records of the two men actually talking about who would actually do those first voice tests. And because Alexander Graham Bell had such a very clear speaking voice, despite having a Scottish accent, because he was from Scotland, Bell was chosen to do the speaking, and Watson was chosen to do the listening. So Alexander Graham Bell submits his patent for an improvement in telegraphy.
Telegraphy. Right.
He receives it on March 7th, 1876. On March 10th, 1876, 3 days later, he's able to have that first conversation with Thomas Watson down the hall of a space. It spanned about 30 feet, and AT&T actually still has that first wire that connected the two men.
That's amazing.
It is.
And so what happened? Like, they were in two separate rooms, and this
Yes.
was in Boston, correct?
Yes, so this was in an attic workshop in Boston.
Okay.
And so the two men were in separate rooms, and what they had done was they had spread it out so that it was that full 30 feet. And so Alexander Graham Bell is in one room using the liquid transmitter, Thomas Watson is in the other room using the reed receiver, so he's holding it up to his ear like this. And Alexander Graham Bell says the very famous phrase, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Now, there is some discrepancy in terms of what Alexander Graham Bell recorded in his notes for saying versus what Thomas Watson actually heard and recorded in his notes. So there is that kind of cool, interesting experiment to see what exactly Alexander Graham Bell claims he said versus what Watson actually heard. But between the two men, that was the very first thing said over the telephone, and that was because it was the best way to test if it actually worked. Because then Watson was able to come back into the room that Bell was in and tell him he had heard him. Now, what's very interesting, and what a lot of people don't realize, is that the next thing said over the telephone that Watson still records in his notebook, that we have a replica on display here in Middletown, is, "How do you do? God save the Queen," and several other articulate sounds.
Okay.
Now, the reason for the God Save the Queen is because Bell at the time was still a Scottish citizen, and the Queen in question is Queen Victoria.
That's great. And we always hear about the first thing. We never heard about
what was the yes.
I just assumed Watson walked in and said, well, how can I help you?
No, not at all. So what ends up happening is, so Watson comes back in. Bell tells Bell that he heard him. The two men switch places.
Okay.
And then Watson, also says stuff into the phone, and then they switch back to then continue the test.
Okay. So what happens from that point? Do we go right to another patent, or how does it work?
No. So then what happens is that the two men continue tinkering because they're trying to figure out how to make this experiment continue to be successful. Because Bell actually had two financial backers that were backing him to try and do all of these experiments. And so they wanted to see the results of all of his hard work. And so at one point, Bell is actually trying to demonstrate this again, and it didn't work. So they're trying to figure out how to make it consistently work.
Right.
And once they have it at that point, Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson actually start doing live demonstrations. And so this is where we start seeing a little bit of showmanship from the two individuals. Because what ends up happening is they have to put on shows to convince people that the telephone is actually working.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is that they'll have a live telephone in a demonstration room, usually in somewhere in Massachusetts, and then they'll have Watson back in their workroom. And what gets happening there is then Watson is playing music, and Alexander Graham Bell is having it play live. So then the audience can hear Watson playing music.
Right.
And it's that whole magic of having that connection without seeing the other person.
I'm always curious to see if, of course, I don't know how we would ever find this out, but like the reaction of people. Did they think this was some kind of toy or game, or did they think, oh my gosh, this is going to revitalize our whole communication system? It doesn't work like that, does it?
So it's actually really fascinating because for a long time it did seem like it was considered a toy. It did seem like it was considered something of that sort. But it's very hard to pinpoint that today because a lot of people did not want to go on record for saying, oh yeah, I believe the telephone was just going to be a toy. I never saw it as anything other than that. And so that's kind of where it's very difficult to pinpoint people saying, oh yes, it's only a toy. Especially after Alexander Graham Bell goes down to the Philadelphia Centennial, and he brings with him his invention and demonstrates it, I think, to the Emperor of Brazil, who says famously, oh my God, it talks. So it's one of those kind of things that Bell very early on is able to prove that it is something scientific, but he's also able to prove that it is a new means of communication. And that's kind of what really starts changing the game. The other thing is that the financial backers were very smart in that the fact that they were doing this as a licensing agreement for various companies. So the original telephone company does not just build itself, they also license out the patent to other franchising companies, what we would call today franchising companies, so that they can start licensing out the patent and building the phone network and et cetera. So, I mean, very quickly on, we have a phone network begin in Connecticut where we have about 21 subscribers. And a telephone directory comes out that same year because you need to know who else you can call on this network. So it very quickly becomes a business, and it very quickly becomes a profitable business.
Oh, sure. I'm sure.
So.
This is total innovation. So I guess the next question is, how did we get from, phone calls from 30 feet away, 15 feet away, whatever it is, to miles and across the world?
That is a wonderful question. AT&T, and even the company before AT&T was actually officially incorporated in 1885, realized very quickly that the network and the telephone are only as good as far as you can go and as fast as you can go and as many people as you can connect. And so what they start building and they start figuring out to do is how to increase the size of the network. AT&T was always pushing the boundaries for how far we could go. We celebrated every new long distance line, even if by today's standards, it was short. So we celebrated when we went from New York to Philly, or actually even further back than that, when we went from Boston to New York. I mean, that's even one of our famous stories because of the spirit of service that occurred during the blizzard of 1888, which for us still in the middle of winter. That was very important because what ended up happening is that the telephone lines were the only thing connecting Boston and New York during that blizzard. And our linemen were patrolling that line to make sure that it did not go down. And so we actually eventually would recognize some of those linemen and asked one of them, named Angus MacDonald, to come in, and so we could paint him. And so therefore we have what is very famously called the spirit of service painting and advertisement. So that was one of our big connections that we celebrated. We then also in 1892 opened the New York to Chicago line. And to make that, we had to use copper wire, very thick copper wire. And that could only handle one call at a time. And I believe it cost, no, you know what? I won't get into the figures. Okay. Stop there. I'll have to give you those figures later. But okay. So we got the New York to Chicago line in 1892, and that was a distance of about 950 miles. AT&T, though, had always wanted to connect the continent from coast to coast. And so that raised the question of how do we do that? And so AT&T starts getting to work with inventing, because we realized that the modern, the current technology that existed at the time was not going to be able to do it. So we needed to invent it ourselves. Okay. And so we do. We come up with the loading coil and the high vacuum tube amplifier, which together help make sure that the signal stays strong enough and clear enough for us to be able to go coast to coast. And we opened that transcontinental line in 1915, which is really remarkable when you consider that, you know, in 1876, we could only go 30 feet. Right. In 1915, we were able to go a span of over 3,000 miles. And then in today's standard of our fiber network, from what I've heard, we have enough to cover the globe 50 times over. Wow. So just remarkable.
So what is the nexus between Bell's first call and kind of the creation of AT&T? How did that work out?
So what's really actually quite interesting is that Alexander Graham Bell has his first call and he has his first patent, and he doesn't want to be a businessman. He actually hands over his business to his financial backers, who form the Bell Telephone Company in 1877. We have the original 7 stock certificates that were issued to those individuals that were forming that company. The very first one actually went to Bell's wife, Mabel Bell. She received 1,497 shares. Wow. Alexander Graham Bell received 10.
Oh my gosh.
It was part of a wedding gift to her.
Nice. She did well.
Yes, she did. He basically, they never had to work another day in their lives.
I'm sure.
They had enough to live off of that. But what ends up happening is we start with the Bell Telephone Company. That then becomes the National Bell Telephone Company. That then becomes the American Bell Telephone Company, which is then bought up by AT&T, which had formed as a subsidiary of the American Bell Telephone Company.
Okay, got it. So I wanted to ask you about some of the AT&T innovations that happened as they were going forward, beyond the ones you already asked. 1927, AT&T begins the first transatlantic telephone service?
We do.
How does that work out?
To London.
That's amazing.
It was really remarkable, because we realized that, so after we had spanned the continent in 1915, there was sort of the question of what can we do next? How much further can we go with our network? And so we start figuring out how to actually go across the oceans. Because we did also go down to Mexico and Canada as well. So it wasn't just, oh, you know, we're going to ignore our neighbors. No, we went into those other countries as well. That was very nice. Yeah. So then we're trying to figure out, how do we get over to London? Now, you have to understand, before the telephone, there was the telegraph cable. Now, that had been laid previously, and that was at best spotty. So AT&T realized that putting a telephone cable down at this particular moment in time would not work. But in 1915, the same year we opened the transcontinental line, we also started testing radio telephones. And we were able to get a successful signal over to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Wow. Which was very impressive. Granted, the engineer only heard the last tail end of the message, but he still heard it. And so that prompted prompted AT&T to realize that that was possible. And we could do that. And so in 1927, we opened to London. In 1928, we opened to Paris.
Wow. As you were talking, I've been watching this picture behind you, and I have to ask you, what is going on here?
This is one of my favorite pictures in the museum. And it's capturing a moment in time that's really remarkable. So this is actually at the Chicago Toll Boards. And what you can kind of get a sense for is how big these switches were, because you can see it's clearly going beyond the picture. And what you can see is all the ladies sitting down are operators. They're all, while simultaneously keeping calls and taking multiple calls in, recording who you are, where you're calling to, and how long that call's going on.
Right.
That's all written down on a slip of paper.
It's on a piece of paper.
On a slip of paper. The girls on
like
roller
you're ordering
skates.
hamburgers.
Yeah, pretty much. That's a good equation for it. The girls on roller skates are wheeling up and down to all the operators, collecting those slips of paper. They're then handing it to the lady sitting at the desk where it's manually compiled, sent down to billing, and added to your monthly bill.
Wow.
Really remarkable because the system still works the same way today, but it's all automated.
Right.
And we care more about data than voice.
Right. All right, you're watching NJBIA's coverage of the AT&T Museum in Middletown. We'll be back right after these words.
In our line of work, reliable communication is the difference between life and death. We need air, water, and information. That information has to move as fast as my firefighters and paramedics. When we switched to FirstNet, our communications became seamless. It allows us to project life-saving resources where they're needed most. Without FirstNet, our ability to coordinate command or response to a crisis would be at risk.
Welcome back to NJBIA's Mind Your Business, where we return to the AT&T Museum in Middletown to learn more about the 150th anniversary of the first phone call and all the telecoms innovations that have happened since then. Have a look. So more AT&T innovations as we go through the years. I'll throw in President Richard Nixon makes the first call to the moon.
He does in 1969.
There was no telephone line going to the moon.
No, there was not.
Okay, so how does this work?
So to actually understand where we get to with President Nixon being able to call the moon, we actually have to back up a few years. That all actually starts with Telstar 1 in 1962.
Right.
AT&T partnered with NASA to launch it. Now what's very interesting about this is we do actually have a Telstar 1 on display in the Middletown Museum. And that is probably one of the coolest pieces that we have because it is original. It is one of the 6 that they had built.
Wow.
When
I'm
they
looking
launched
at
it.
now.
Yes.
Wow.
It's just amazing. And the really cool part is that they built 6 because they weren't sure what was going to happen when they launched the first one. Because again, you have to understand, NASA is still learning how much force do we get with the rockets and all of that other kind of stuff. They're also still learning, hey, does this trajectory work or does it not? Does it cause it to come back down and crash, etc. So we're still trying to figure all that out. In addition, we're also still trying to figure out, does this stuff actually still work up in space?
Right.
Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe not.
And so that's kind of where it gets very interesting. And so we built 6 because we were like, okay, absolute worst case scenario, we have spares. So we launched the first one up into space. It goes off successfully. We're able to actually use it. It's the first active communication satellite. We're able to ping signals off of it. And for the first time, we're able to have live television across the Atlantic, real time, groundbreaking.
Yeah.
It also, a little bit more information about the satellite. It weighs about 175 pounds because that's all NASA told us they could launch.
Right.
And it's about 3 feet around. So very small.
Right.
But very powerful. The problem is that after Starfish Prime testing goes off in the upper atmosphere, the amount of radiation kills the satellite.
Oh.
Unfortunate.
Right.
Very unfortunate. Yeah. The really cool part is the engineers on the ground were able to reboot the satellite.
Oh, on the ground? Okay.
Yes.
Wow.
Because obviously you don't have a giant cable, following it.
Yeah.
So they were able to send the signal up to the satellite, get it rebooted so that it was able to continue to work and actually come back to life.
Amazing.
And again, super amazing for that. But eventually that satellite does go down, so we launched Telstar 2, which is the exact same one. And so again, able to successfully use it, and it goes off without a hitch. Now what's very interesting is that Telstar 3 happens a couple years after, well, not just a couple, more than a couple years after that. And we have a model of that in the AT&T Archives and History Center, and that one is over 1,000 pounds and over 6 feet long. So it's a much, much bigger satellite than what we have with Telstar 1. Now what's interesting though is that the 4 remaining satellites are actually all on display. So we have one at the Smithsonian in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. We have one at Nokia Murray Hill. We have one here in the Middletown Museum for AT&T. And then we have a satellite company that has it on display in their headquarters.
Oh, no kidding.
And 3 of those 4 satellites are in New Jersey.
That's amazing. Well, good for New Jersey on that.
Yes, very much so. But the more important part is, from Telstar, is that AT&T proves that it can work with NASA as a general contractor to help them get a man on the moon. And so that's what AT&T does. In addition to providing all of the network and everything like that, AT&T also takes on the role as a general contractor for all of NASA's missions up until the moon launch.
Right.
And so we end up not only doing that, but then we have that the NASA moon launch, and obviously Nixon's famous call to the moon in 1969. Now, what's very interesting about that is that that would have been our longest long-distance call ever.
Yeah, sure.
And I cannot find a bill.
I wonder how much that went for.
Yes, I have many questions about that as well.
Right. And were there roaming charges? We don't know.
Right, yeah. Because, I mean, you know, that's a bit of a distance. But no, that is AT&T's longest long-distance call ever, despite the fact that we have done several around-the-world calls previously.
Right.
And so we did calls where we would have some AT&T executives in one room, and they would call out around the network, and they would literally be talking to the executive in another room.
I wanted to talk about some of the innovation things we have on display here. Well, going back to the first call, there is that the microphone?
So
or
that
it's
is
the receiver?
That is the liquid transmitter.
Liquid transmitter. Okay.
Yes. So that is a replica of the liquid transmitter that Alexander Graham Bell used. Sitting next to it is Thomas Watson's replica, again, of the reed receiver that Watson used to listen.
Right.
And then what's next to that, and probably the most interesting of those three items in the case that are all next to each other, is Thomas Watson's notebook, a replica again.
Yeah.
And so that is one of the most interesting items that the AT&T Archives and History Center has.
In that notebook, even though it was a replica, you were able to get it from, I guess, other source material. Like, can kind of determine what was written in there and how it was written. Were there other things other than science in that notebook?
Oh, yes. So Thomas Watson was a typical inventor of the day, which meant he was not very wealthy, and he was using a very standard stationary notebook of the time. He also wrote in pencil, which is horrible for long-term preservation and display. And so he just used his notebook as one would. So he would slip it into his coat pocket, he'd take it out when he had a spark of invention. And so he not only records the very invention of the telephone, which is very important, but he also records how much he owes for laundry and groceries and, you know, his daily life.
Right. And what about, you said something about earlier about a shmoo phone?
Oh, yes.
What is that?
So one of the shmoo phones. Shmoo phone.
How do you spell that?
SHMOO.
Okay.
Shmoo.
Okay.
So it looks more like a bowling pin than an actual phone, which I've always thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
And that is because what AT&T was trying to do was it was trying to figure out how to get a rotary dial comfortable in a handset so that people would be able to use it without it being too uncomfortable. Because before that point, and we do also have a collection of instruments, or telephones on display, so you can see the evolution of this. Before that point, it had always been on the phone itself, never in the handset, because the handset had been too small or the rotary dial too big. And so the shmoo phone was the designer's way of experimenting with that to try and make it so that it would be more comfortable for people to use. And the shmoo is also kind of unique in the innovation case where it sits, because it's not something that we would generally consider on the face groundbreaking or earth-changing. But it is very important because it does change how people interact with the phone.
Right. I just think it's great that you, even if that's not the greatest invention ever, it's just steps of progress that you can literally see in this one innovation display here.
Yes, no, the innovation case has so many different steps of progress. And it also kind of alludes to the fact that AT&T touches on so many more things than people mostly assume today. They mostly think of AT&T as a telecommunications company. We've done so much more than that. And it's so cool to be able to show that and to just kind of talk about it. For example, we got into electrical sound recording with metal stamping masters, which if you're listening to records today, that is based on AT&T technology and innovation. If you're watching movies or watching this broadcast, you're listening to something with electrical sound recording. That is another AT&T innovation. Granted, we partnered with Warner Brothers, a then small studio, back in 1926 to release the first film with sound effects called Don Juan. And supposedly, according to the research that we have, there were reviews that said, you can keep Don Juan, I want to keep the sound. that was how magical it was.
That's great.
And so then in 1927, The Jazz Singer was released.
That's right.
And
that was Al Jolson.
Yeah. And that was considered the first talkie. For those that have not seen those films, I always like to reference Singing in the Rain as something that AT&T did without the musical numbers.
Right, that's great. And then there's this beigey thing over there. Is it a picture phone, an early form of it?
Yes, so the Mod 2 picture phone released in the 1970s. And this is one of AT&T's very interesting stories because technology-wise, it was a resounding success. The picture was clear, the sound quality was great, but it became the commercial question.
Right.
And it actually ended up failing for 3 reasons. The first being that it was very expensive to use. So it was expensive to buy, and then it was expensive to actually use. Right. The second is that you had to call someone else who had a picture phone. So it became sort of the question of like, how do you get somebody else to buy one if it was so expensive and use it with you? The third was something that still plagues us today, and that not everyone wants to be on camera for every phone call.
Right.
Although some high schoolers claim that. I would be like, yeah, sure, go ahead, get on FaceTime every time you want to get on a phone call or a text message. So, but that is one of AT&T's more interesting stories because we actually first introduced it at the 1964 World's Fair, where we had it in 2 locations, and you could call coast to coast and actually see someone live on the camera on the other end. And people at the fair loved it.
Oh, yeah.
So AT&T executives thought, the wave of the future. And so we invested in it, and we came out with the Mod 2 picture phone. And it did not work out. But its predecessor still lives on today with Zoom and Teams and all other kinds of Skype, Google Hangouts, your preferred virtual meeting of choice.
Right.
And so it's just really remarkable how, while it may not have worked out at its time, it still continues to affect us today.
So speaking of kids, if they ever come to this museum, are their minds blown by what's happened here?
Oh, absolutely, all the time. Like every kid that walks through this museum is always fascinated by the history that we have on display here. They're always amazed by how much AT&T has done and how far we've come. Right. And that's kind of really the biggest thing, is that we've spent over 150 years connecting people, and we've changed how people do that in such a way that it's no longer possible to be like, oh yeah, that's how we used to do it like 50 years ago, 60 years ago. We've done that for over 150 years. And that's what's really remarkable about this. And furthermore, I'll say this for some of the older people in the audience, the expressions of high schoolers and younger trying to use a rotary phone are fascinating. There is such bafflement over the fact that you have to wait for the dial to go all the way back. And then there's always the comments of, oh my God, that takes forever. And it's like, yes. This is why when touch-tone dialing was introduced in the 1960s, people leapt at the opportunity. But I always also use that as an option and an opportunity to tell people this is how we actually had area codes figured out before touch-tone dialing was introduced. Because for the area codes, you always wanted those shortest pulls of the dial for the operators. So that meant that, like New York City, for example, at 212, was the fastest pull of the dial that you could get with a rotary phone. And so that is why you'll have places like New York, Washington, D.C., etc. They all have very short area codes. Right. And then when you get to the less popular places, or the places that got added in later, such as some parts of New Jersey with a 908 area code, that is ridiculously slow on a rotary dial.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yes.
So as we talk about AT&T and all this innovation that they've done since the first phone call 150 years ago, we could be here forever talking about this.
Oh, we could, yes.
But I wanted to look just ahead a little bit. With this celebration of the anniversary, AT&T has announced an investment and a spend of more than $250 billion in the future of U.S. advanced connectivity. How important is that for AT&T to continue that kind of forward motion?
Well, I have to say AT&T's commitment to that investment is something that's really great, obviously, for our country and for our telecommunication network, first off. I will also then say, from my perspective as an archivist, which is a rather unique perspective, is because I'm looking at it from the perspective of looking, from behind, is that it seems to be the continuation of our investment in the network. And that seems to be something that AT&T has already done for 150 years, and will continue to do, hopefully, for the next 150 years.
All right, a big thank you to Archives Manager Melissa Knoll, as well as AT&T Regional Vice President Jacqueline Cater for all the information and access at the AT&T Museum in Middletown. And thank you for joining us on NJBI is Minding Your Business. We'll see you next time.